There we are. Here we are, live. Good afternoon, First Presbyterian Church family, and welcome to part 4 of the 4-part series of Talking to Strangers. Stuart, Gordon, and I have been hosting these conversations throughout the month.
We are.
Oh,
Here we are,
sorry,
live.
my computer's
Good.
playing. Stuart, Gordon, and I have been hosting these conversations, and every week I seem to mess with the technology a little bit more than I should have. I'm sorry. But we have gone through Gladwell's book here, kind of point by point, at least his big ideas. And this final part 4 is going to be looking at the case that he sort of couches the conversation in. This is the case of Sandra Bland. And as we get going here, Stuart, I'm just going to hand it off to you and let us help us get this conversation started, Stuart.
Yeah, I was just saying to Josh before we came on that this is the chapter that confirms for me that you have to read the book, okay? There's no way we're going to do justice to the amount of detail involved in this description of the encounter between Officer Brian Encenia and Sandra Bland. We'll give you a big picture view of it and encourage you to read the book. I asked to share a story because I think context is crucial. One of the big elements of life in America today is the ability for us to see cell phone footage, body cam footage of interactions between police and citizens. And it reminds me every time of something I learned in 1986 when I was in my first job out of college in Washington, D.C., taking high school students around Capitol Hill doing civics education. And we would take them to the U.S. Capitol, show them the building, go inside the House and Senate chambers. Television was fairly new to the chambers of the House and the Senate at the time. And so you could go in and visit, and you could see where the cameras were set up in the House. And the first thing I learned was when you turn on C-SPAN, and you watch the proceedings of the House of Representatives, you have camera angles on the floor in front of the dais, and you see members speaking to the gathered body. Mm-hmm. I learned inside the room that typically, as that person is speaking, there's nobody in the room. Yeah. You get the impression from seeing it on television that the House is full with all the 435 members as it would be for a State of the Union address, mm-hmm. and that there is a deliberative conversation going on there. Mm-hmm. What you learn in going inside is that typically nobody's in the room. And the people funny. Speaking are speaking for the benefit of the cameras, speaking for the benefit of whoever will be watching on C-SPAN, so that their remarks might be entered into the congressional record, but nobody's actually listening in the room. And I don't know, for some reason that made a difference to me when I learned that. But it's another example of how context matters enormously. We mentioned the first law of biblical interpretation is context, context, context. It's related to coupling, which mm-hmm. Malcom Gladwell introduces to us, that our behavior is tied to place and time. And so when I see video footage of what goes on between police officers and citizens, mm-hmm. I always remind myself, I may think I'm seeing the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth here, but I'm not. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing what happened in this snippet of time. I don't know what happened before that led into this, and I don't know what happened after. And so I have to be very cautious not to come to conclusions about the snippet I see in time. There's some conclusions one might draw from that, but I think we all do well not to presume that because we see a certain amount of footage that we know exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. And that, Stuart, to be totally honest, this is what you just said is so controversial right now, mm-hmm. because there are people who are saying, well, it seems it's so obvious. We don't need mm-hmm. anything more. This mm-hmm. 48 seconds was enough for us to know we know all we need to know from this. And there are some people who would block out anything else. And then there are some people who, the phrase of like, well, we don't know what happened before they turned on the camera. And mm-hmm. there's this sense of just this sort of suspicion to let the camera tell you anything, or somehow, well, something must have happened to justify all of this, is sort of the way that some people approach the conversation. Which I'll share this with you. This is a bit tongue in cheek. Someone was posting on social media, and it was like, video shows picture of Jesus hanging on cross. Someone in the comment section asked, yeah, but what did he do before they turned the camera on? And I thought that, people are so clever nowadays. But in general, there's also this sense where people, it kind of falls into these categories, right? Some people are saying all you need is a video. You don't need anything else, which is not true. And then some people will say it doesn't matter what they did, or it doesn't matter how they were treated here because they must have done something beforehand. And so I don't need to watch that video with any sort of legitimacy. That's not going to show me anything. And both of the extremes when you approach it are just not helpful. It's like, right. Yeah, you can look at something. There are certainly videos we have seen recently, even in our media, and we know, okay, obviously there are things here that seem incredibly inappropriate. Like, across the board, people would say this is not necessary. But that doesn't mean just because a video captured something that's unnecessary or inappropriate means that everything about the situation was. You still have to, there still has to be work done to understand the larger context. If not, it's just, it's unhelpful. And I don't know, maybe I'm in a minority in thinking this, but we have allowed too much of media. Man, I'm about to say this, Stuart. I think we've allowed too much of our media to become judge, jury, and executioner.
Oh, yeah.
In the way that they put this out. And I know that people on every side will be upset about that, but that's my personal opinion of course, when justice needs to be served or there are tragedies that happen, the last thing you want to do is say, well, let's subject this to months or years long process or whatever it may be to figure out how we get to that. But, I know our pendulum is swinging right now, but the opposite of, well, we just need a 40-second clip to make all those decisions just seems very flippant with
I agree completely. And I took a class on media and American politics, again, way back in the 80s, maybe before you were born.
87, baby. Come on.
Dang, I'm an old man. But you just step back and think a minute about the implications of media. It's not only the influence that media have upon us are not simply in the way that they describe or portray what happens. It's also in what they decide to show us. It's necessary. I mean, back when you had 3 network newscasts and they were 30 minutes each, there was a very limited scope of what got reported. Now, what has changed in the last 40 years is that there are way more outlets. And so presumably there is more content out there available. But along with that has been the increase in tribalization of media, so that we see those things through our social media accounts that tend to gravitate toward the way we think. And we don't see those things that are a way, share no affinity with the way that we think. And so our limitations are not because there aren't enough sources. Our limitations are because they're so curated by the people who share them with us. And so it's important to remember, of all the things going on out there in the world, other people are deciding what it is we pay attention to. And just understand, we are thinking with other people. Other people are deciding what we're going to see, and therefore having an enormous impact on what we think is important and what's going on. And you just need to think critically about that. Yep,
absolutely. So let's, we're not going to be able to do justice to the whole of the Sandra Bland case, and we won't do all the justice of her life and her tragic death. We won't be able to, but let's, for someone who has no idea who Sandra Bland is, let's do a little bit of, this is the basics of how it unfolded, and let's kind of look back and see what Gladwell's tried to prepare us for in the case. Do you want to just give us an overview of what happens with Sandra Bland?
Yeah, Sandra Bland, a 28-year-old African-American woman who has moved from Chicago to 50 miles outside of, is it Prairie View, Texas?
I think that's right, yeah.
50 miles outside Houston, a rural area, starting her life anew, has a new job. She's working at the university there, and has, I mean, just there in town. She's got Illinois plates on her car, for crying out loud. And she is stopped by a police officer who has been trained in a way of policing that Gladwell would say is the
Kansas
Bernie.
City.
Yeah, well, I was going to go back to Bernie Madoff and the Greek guy who was the holy fool.
Oh yeah,
who distrusts everything, doesn't believe anything he hears. And Brian Encinia was trained in a police strategy like that, where you can't default to truth, in which you have to presume the worst, and you look for any excuse possible to stop someone and to have probable cause to look. And so he sees this car with the plates, and he comes up behind her on a state highway. He zooms up behind her very close so that she's going to move over so that he can get by. She doesn't signal her lane change, which gives him his excuse to pull her over. Now, Sandra Bland had a lot of run-ins with the police on minor issues. She had something like $8,000 in fines from minor issues with the police. And so she was just up to here with police stopping her.
Yep.
Up to here with, she's trying to start a new life, and she's here a day, and boom, here we go again.
Yep. I just got here and it's already starting.
Already going downhill. And so it deteriorates very quickly. And so there's a script from the conversation that they had, that it was recorded, and you have to read the whole thing in the book to see how it just deteriorates, this conversation between two strangers, between the young black woman and the police officer who has been trained not to default to truth, not to presume the best about her, but to presume there's probably something wrong here.
Yep.
And so he ends up arresting her. She ends up in jail, and ends up taking her own life in jail, hanging herself in jail at the depth of her despair about the way her life is going. It's a very tragic story.
Yeah, it's awful. And what emerged from that interaction is that at some point Sandra Bland starts recording the interaction on her phone. And we've already said it, that it deteriorates so quickly, but it goes from this basic interaction of, she's upset, she thinks she's getting a ticket, and the conversation, I won't read it verbatim, but he kind of says, are you done? She's kind of expressed that she's upset, and she goes, yeah, I'm done. And then she lights the cigarette, which it was really funny, because I thought, I've lived in communities and places in my life where lighting a cigarette, everybody lights a cigarette all the time. It's not at all disrespectful, and Gladwell even talks about it as it's a sign to calm yourself down, right? You're all upset, you light a cigarette and you calm yourself down. And Encinia seems to take that, he asks her to put it out. She doesn't have to, but responding that way, again, like just trying to look at it of two different sides. So I've also been in communities where to light a cigarette in front of someone, it's seen as disrespectful, that you would do that. Oh yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go.
The fact that you would pull a cigarette out at all in front of some people when you're having an interaction with seemingly someone in authority is like, you better put that thing away. Like, this is not the time for that. And so when I read that, I thought, man, it is so easy for me to think, one, she's just trying to calm herself down. And two, hey, you should wait just a few minutes. Let him give you that ticket and then light your cigarette. Don't do it yet. He's not going to like that. But from that situation, he gets all hot and bothered. And Gladwell walks, through, step by step where things could have been different if he just would have said, I'm actually not giving you a ticket today. I just, doing my duty here, ma'am, go on and, signal next time. And so goes the story. He didn't intend to give her a ticket. There are so many situations, but again, you have two strangers who are misreading each other seemingly at every step of the way, to the point where he says he was fearful for his life over and over again. That's kind of how he recounts it. And there are some facts to support that. But in other situations, it's like she's just holding her phone, she's smoking a cigarette, and she's just trying to get out of this awful situation, and it's obviously not going well. But again,
this is where
it deteriorates so quick.
It deteriorates, and one thing that's important to me in saying here is I don't think we're in the business. We're not interested in doing a blow by blow about who should have said what in any conflicted circumstance, whether you're talking about the Israelis and the Palestinians or Sandra Bland and Brian Encinia or you and your spouse. It does not do anybody any good to get into a he said, she said. It does not do anybody any. If you're interested in some sort of resolution, as Lily Dietz has said in my Sunday school class many times about marriage, her dad would always say, you can be right or you can be married.
Yeah.
And it's a good standard if you're ever interested in resolving things rather than just ascribing blame. Than doing a blow by blow about what he should have said there and what he should not have done or what she should not have done there. It's not helpful. Now, I'll say this about media. This is one of the worst things about contemporary media is that is all they do is invite people to Monday morning quarterback. They will put video up there and they will invite you to respond in some way to who was right and who was wrong. And that is a recipe for disaster. It is a recipe for personal conflict, for social conflict, for national and international conflict. And so we are not interested in playing that game, which just feeds people's ratings and makes money for people. What we're interested in is how can we learn from this particular book and anything that's out there is how can we approach strangers differently instead of blaming the police officer who was doing as he was trained to do. How can we pay attention to what we know to train people better, to help people do their jobs effectively, which I'm sure is what he wants to do. He wants to do his job effectively. And as a society, we want to do it effectively. We want to have people, as the point of Mr. Sherman in the book is, you want to be very precise about how you use these police tactics in those small areas where they're really needed, so that you spare all the other people whom you inconvenience and alienate by using the wrong tactics in the wrong situation. Yeah.
And Stuart, what you just said is a hard pill to swallow because, well, my thought is, I can hear someone listening to our conversation and saying, no, you watched the video. We have enough evidence. Brian Encinia was totally wrong. I'm invited to ascribe blame and I feel confident in doing so. And the only thing we need to do right now is seek out justice for Sandra Bland. I have that voice in my head, and I know that voice represents a large amount of people. And it's so hard to navigate because I think, one, I'm not anyway trained in police tactics. The most I know I got from Malcom Gladwell, who's a
not a police officer,
popular author from Canada. It in no way, I'm not a reliable source for such things. But there's just this unrest in so many people right now, and it sits so deep within people, and not just unrest, but it's a holy anger, it's a holy rage, because it's not just we say the case of Sandra Bland, but the case of Sandra Bland represents so much of our society right now. And there's so many things that are typified in a case like this right now. It sort of checks all the boxes, white male, black woman, police officer, go down the line. And my sense is that it is, in no way do we want to say, no, you can't seek out justice quickly. This is, we don't want to just turn it into, you just need to be patient, let the system do what it does. That's not what I hear you saying. I hear you saying that more so as Christians and as people who are trying to be faithful, not just faithful Christians, but good citizens, we just have to remember that more is required of us than what the media wants, than what the media would have us believe. There is more that's required of a good citizen than just the media saying, watch this snippet, make your conclusions, post your post. That's all the media needs from you right now. And we can confuse that with thinking that it's somehow a moral thing, but in the reality, there's a lot that can be done. I'm not just trying to throw the media under the bus, but there are agendas out there of like, watch this, draw your conclusions that we've sort of put out there for you to draw, and then go post your post, and our ratings will go up and everybody will be good. And then Sandra Bland, her life and the tragedy of it all gets lost somewhere along the way. And there are citizens that we're not anymore invited into the deeper conversations of what does it mean, certainly to be a faithful Christian, but what does it mean to be a good citizen so that these situations stop happening, so that, not to be utopic or to try to create a utopia, but how do we get to a place where less of these things are happening at the very least?
When you and I had our initial conversation about this, we did the podcast, did the review of the book. We finished with, the question about, how does this invite a Christian into this? And I mentioned the Westminster Larger Catechism, its treatment of the 10 Commandments. And with the commandment, thou shalt not kill, as with all the commandments, it asks what are the responsibilities, the duties required of us from this commandment, not only what are the sins that it prohibits, but what are the duties required of us. And in the commandment on thou shalt not kill is included the summons, the commandment to preserve life, to preserve all life. And so, yes, more is required of us if we're trying to follow Jesus.
Yeah.
More is required of us than that we have a political perspective on this. Yeah. More is required of us than to be able to live within our respective bubbles, and not care about the well-being of the people around us. And I know that's a high bar. I always have to aspire to that bar. This season has challenged me in my comfort with my suburban, lifestyle, in which I'm sequestered away from what so many people have to deal with on a regular basis. And I think it's too easy for many of us to be content with the way things are and to feel no responsibility to care how things are for other people. And I think Jesus just puts a higher bar in front of us and says, you're summoned to this as someone who follows me. Yeah.
And this is a little off topic, but I think I'll bring it back a little bit. As you were talking, I thought I had a class, War in the Christian Conscience in seminary, and it looked at pacifism, and we read John Howard Yoder. And one of the things, the general sentiment around pacifism is like, oh, you just don't want to do anything. Oh, you just want to opt out. You just don't want to get involved. You don't want to get your hands dirty. And John Howard Yoder's approach was mostly to say that if you take pacifism seriously and you take it with the due respect that it deserves, much more is required of you. There is so much more required of you to navigate this faithfully and following Jesus, not just, oh, I'm a pacifist, I don't want to, whatever it is. That's the caricature to get people to say,
you can dismiss it.
Yeah, I've had people say, you can be a pacifist because I'm the person toting the guns. That's the that's the way people dismiss it. But the same is true here. You could hear the conversation around, if you watch the video that's posted on Facebook about something and you say, that's not right. And then you go to your Instagram and say, I'm going to post about how I think that's not right. And then you finish and you say, okay, I did it. It's like, hold on now. Yeah. Just because you watched the video, you drew the conclusions, and then you posted about it, somehow that person right now is seen as like the righteous person of our culture. And it's like, there's so much, what else must be done right now? How are police tactics being addressed in this? There's such a call right now to be more involved in politics. And, if you want to see some of this stuff change, it's going to require way more of you than a post on Instagram. It may require you to consider, maybe I'm actually the person that should be running for this such and such campaign. And, for a Christian to be involved at that sort of civil, in that sort of civil discourse with, your community. Again, it's not, I don't hear us, I want to be clear here of like, I don't hear us saying, hey, you're not allowed to draw conclusions in, so just, sort of dismiss it as like, no, much more. The hope of looking at something like Gladwell, the conversations that I've had with you is that, like, hopefully this takes people to say, okay, we got to take this way more seriously. It's not just that we're condemning some sort of social media posting. It's that we're hoping that when people think about their faith, you go back to the 10 Commandments, that in following Jesus, we're not just trying to, check boxes, but we're trying to say, we got to get all the way into this. We have to, boots on the ground, get in the bunker side by side and figure out, how do we live more faithfully? How do we actually make sure that more life is preserved in our country as Christians? Because maybe we're the only people that are going to fight with this sort of resiliency and this sort of endurance and the power of the Spirit that's going to work some of this stuff out. So sorry, I just wanted to say that much more will be required. It's not just a sort of dismissal of that sort of response, but much more being required. We've gone way left to center here. I meant to go back at each idea that Gladwell had. We kind of looked at default to truth. And I guess I addressed transparency a little bit, but where do you see his idea of transparency playing out in the interaction between Sandra Bland? Just the sense of how was he priming our understanding of that?
He presumed transparency. He presumed that what he saw was what he got. What he saw, and he said he feared for his life. Now, I will be among the first to say that I am not going to judge a police officer for feeling threatened in the exercise of his or her duties. If every day you have to put a gun on your hip and you go into situations in which you are going to face opposition and threat, I'm not going to judge anybody for feeling threatened because I don't know what it's like to be in that circumstance. And so here's one of the challenging things, and I'll push back against Gladwell. I'm not saying he's wrong, but I just think this is incredibly easy to tell to a police officer, not so easy to live out. What he says is insignia presumes transparency, presumes that what he sees is an anxious, frightened, angry woman, and his life may be at risk. And Gladwell says he needs to dismiss that, and he needs to understand that there's something more complicated going on there. That may be the goal. But boy, when you think about the little training that police officers get, think about how challenging that is. It's one of the things going on in Nashville right now. I mean, if you're in Nashville and you want to do something, I mean, the season is now. The mayor's office is undertaking a search for the next police chief. It is instituting standards for training and expectations for police officers and supports for police officers to kind of help that they need because they have stressful jobs. Now is the season to know what's going on. Okay, read the papers and find out from the mayor's office what's going on. Take part in public conversations that are happening. The Community Oversight Board invites that. In fact, I think it's next Monday is the last seminar or open forum that they're having on the subject. Frankly, I'm not sure where I am on the powers of the Community Oversight Board. I'm not persuaded that the Community Oversight Board is the answer to Nashville's problems, but I am persuaded that it's a necessary conversation for us to have. And that's one of the things I feel called to do is if I'm going to care, then I at least need to listen. I need to be engaged with people who feel very strongly about it passionately because of impacts in their life, and be part of a public conversation. And to be willing to look out for the interest of others rather than myself.
So this is perfect. So Lipscomb Davis shared a comment here on our YouTube stream. So I'll pull it up here. Can you see that there, Stuart?
Oh, thank you, Lipscomb.
There we go. So he says it feels ubiquitous. It feels like a ubiquitous problem in the church that people compartmentalize their faith, and it doesn't always bear into current events in politics. Which some of what you're saying here, Stuart, is, for the Christian, to understand that their identity in Jesus has everything to do with their citizenship in the country that they serve, or that it has. How do I want to say that? Well, let me just punt to you for a moment, Stuart. When you see Lipscomb's comment there, how would you interact with that, with his statement there?
Well, yeah, I think it's true. Let's say, first of all, the Reformed tradition, which we represent, the Presbyterian Church is part of the theological tradition of the Reformed tradition, has always had a very strong emphasis on the public consequences of faith. Believing in the sovereignty of God, we believe that there's no square inch of the earth over which God is not sovereign. Mm-hmm. And so it does not make sense. Now, we're not from other traditions that are like cloistered monastic, where you move away from the world, you pray for the world, but you're not engaged in the world. Mm-hmm. Our particular tradition says, yes, your faith has implications for your civic engagement. And you are called to be engaged civically because you believe that Jesus is Lord over the whole earth. Yeah. Now, the challenge obviously is that Jesus is way above any nation, any era, any political party, any political philosophy. My friend Jeff Dale, I argue with him all the time. Jesus was not a libertarian. Yeah. He just wasn't. Libertarianism didn't exist when Jesus took on flesh. Yeah. And so you can, in good conscience, be a Christian and be on opposite sides of the political aisle from other Christians. That, to me, is what makes it difficult, because there are many people who think if you're a Christian, you have to be a Democrat. Mm-hmm. Or if you're a Christian, you have to be a Republican. And Jesus is just bigger than any political party in any one space in time in history in any particular country. And so when the rubber hits the road, it gets really messy. Yeah, absolutely. And hearing that, Stuart, the one could walk away and say, "Well, it's so messy. I don't even know what to." But it's not a mess that we can't navigate. Right. It's not a mess that we lack the resources to clean up, to be a more faithful looking church. It is such a shame, and I've heard all sorts of people talk about it, but when the church starts to look exactly like the American political landscape of people sit over here, people sit over here, and we argue, it is just such a mistake to posture ourselves that way, because there's more going on. Sarah Bird gives us a perfect comment here to capture the sentiment that I'm trying to get at. We don't serve a donkey or an elephant. We serve the Lamb. Come on, Sarah, that'll preach. But there is some sense in all of this that when you say my identity is rooted in Christ, that bigness of Jesus, that thing is going to triumph over all sorts of other agendas and all sorts of other identities, and everything else sort of has it plays a different role, right? If we're saying that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is going to define me and guide me, that's going to mess with all sorts of things. I had a Facebook friend, I won't call him a friend, post during one of the elections. It's voting day. When you go in there, don't vote based on your this and this and this, and don't vote based on your faith or this or this. Just vote based on facts and da-da-da. And I was like, are you kidding me? What a worthless comment. And I thought, especially as a Christian, I was offended as a Christian. Like, I thought, as someone who's trying to faithfully follow Jesus, fumbling forward as often as I may, there is still a sense that if that's where you cast your, if that's where you've been called, if faith has been the gift that you've received, then there's no way that you approach any sort of election booth without Jesus at the forefront of, this has to be a faithful act that I'm committing right now, right? It can't just be that it's something that I've rationalized or something that, well, I've always been this, my parents have always, whatever it may be. This has got to be a faithful act, like any other act, right? Especially if we think that it matters the way that we say it does. There's no way you could approach it with this sort of flippancy of, I'm a Democrat. Let me offer one guide for you, because I agree with you completely. I think here's the thing: your friend, it was facts, facts. Well, let's face it. Every human being has a very small RAM in the head. And so you can't take all facts. You're not a computer. You can't take all facts into account when you're voting.
Yep.
You're going to take into account the facts that matter to you.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to filter out the things that don't matter to you, and you're going to vote for the things that do matter to you. So a lot of my Christian friends are going to vote for Donald Trump because they want a Supreme Court that is going to be a conservative Supreme Court. I'm cool with that, because everybody at the end of the day is going to vote his or her own interests. Mm-hmm. That's what politics is. It's competing interest. Mm-hmm. I think a higher bar that Jesus calls us to, and maybe a little more doable in things like who's the police chief going to be, mm-hmm. is to take Jesus seriously when Paul says, do not look to your own interest, but to the interest of others.
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge of citizenship. You're going to vote your self-interest, okay? You're going to vote what does the stock market good for your 401k, and you're going to vote for the person who's going to put judges on the court whom you won't. But let me offer this caution. Please do not for a minute think that means you're voting Christian and other people are not.
Yeah. You're
voting your interests. And it's politics. That's the way it goes. And there's nothing wrong with that, okay? But we are called in our life in society to do something other than look out for our own interests. We are called in following Jesus to look out for other people's interests. And that's the challenge to me and to all of us who are comfortable, who aren't dealing with policing problems in our neighborhoods, mm-hmm. to listen to the Lord Jesus say, this is local, it is political, it is manageable. This is doable. Pay attention to the interest of others and do what you can for their well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's man, that is right on the head of the nail, Stuart, because there's so many. Well, here's my sense. If you're voting because you think this candidate is going to do the best work for your 401k, you'd better have some really high, faithful stewardship, great, generous goals with that 401k. You know what I mean?
You're preaching to me, man. You're stepping on my toes.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking that 401k, it better not be so that at the end of the day, you just get to live even more comfortably, right? That 401k had better be bringing kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Yeah. And if it's not, then please forgive my dismissal of your 401k as I walk into the booth. Here, Sarah Bird gave us an amen. It probably did. I don't know. But there's my sense of because the Christian at the end of the day, there's it's not just that you are, the concern ultimately that Jesus showed, that God shows the world in Jesus, that Jesus calls us to show to the world, to our neighbors and to God. That is not a concern. That is not a concern that we could take lightly, or that would stop at some sense that, my life just gets better. If my life gets better in my election, mm-hmm. my interest, if that's where they stop, forgive me for not being that compelled by your interest in yourself, right? And that's just the Christian calling. If it sounds like a high bar, not my bar. If you read if you read through the New Testament and everything that Jesus calls you to do, right? If you read through Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, the bar and the standards that are set and that are expected and that we're called to, it's not like Jesus came down. Here's a good Bible story for us. When the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says, I've done, I followed all the laws. What should I do now? And he's like, give away all your possession. And the rich young ruler says that he walks away because he has a whole lot of them.
Very sad.
It's very sad. But my friend pointed out one time, you know what Jesus didn't say? He didn't say, well, hold on. Let's just start with 10% of your possessions and then we'll go from there. You know what? Actually, let's just start with 50% and then we'll go from there. Jesus just sort of puts it out there of this is the next faithful step for you. And it's going to require a whole lot more of you. And we'll go from there. And, the guy walks away and Jesus lets him because there was something about the interest that he had in himself in that moment that that Jesus said you can't do both here, right? So that's quick exegesis of that text. I don't want to say that I handled it perfectly, but there is something of the standard that Jesus sets for a Christian and the calling on their life that it just requires a whole lot more than your own self-interest.
I would conclude from that it's impossible. That's the question that comes out. Jesus says, eye of a needle, easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for the rich man to enter the kingdom. And Peter says, well, then who can? And Jesus says it's impossible. Mm-hmm. Jesus, the life he calls us to is impossible. It's miraculous because we are self-interested people. And when we go into the voting booth, we might like to tell ourselves that we're thinking of other people, but whether we are Republican or Democrat, liberal, conservative, we're voting our own interest. And so, people want to upend the power structure and they're going to vote for one side, and people for whom the power structure works right now are going to vote the other side. And they're both voting in their own self-interest. And so I don't want to idolize any political party. Frankly, I taught civics, like I said, in the 80s. I was a political junkie. I have grown so disenchanted with politics in this country. I love Jesus and I love the Reformed tradition. And I'm way more interested in being an advocate for Jesus through the Reformed tradition than I am for any political party.
I'm going to give you another. I'm going to give you another Sarah Bird.
Viewers, if I have offended you with what I've said, it's probably unavoidable that I'm going to do that. But I want to stress that I think Jesus is Lord and that he is judge over both major political parties that happen to exist in the United States of America, which is about a 240-year-old country in the history of the world. And these political parties weren't even there at the beginning. And I just want to say, I want to qualify our political standings because we think they are ultimate and they are not. Jesus is ultimate and he stands in judgment over every limited human perspective.
There it is. I'm going to give you another Sarah Bird amen. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. Well, now that Sarah Bird said amen, I can just use her comment over and over again. Now I'm using her amen. So there it is. And Stuart, I think that's a perfect place to stop. I think the whole of our conversation is we really
digressed on that, didn't we?
We did. And I'm sure there are people that hear this and say we didn't do justice to Sandra Bland. I hope we have given a glimpse. We couldn't do the whole of her life justice. I hope we've done some good with Malcom Gladwell's book. We came into this conversation because we knew that the book was one that was good for now, good for the conversation to be had right now. But ultimately, I think, Stuart, what you just said is what we're after. We're just trying to say that Jesus is ultimate, and following him is going to require all of this of you, and it'll require humility and a lot more work than what our political citizenship will most of the time.
And I need to say, don't let my statement, dictate things. You have to be engaged. Yep. If you're a Christian, you got to choose. Be a Republican, be a Democrat, be engaged, but understand your ultimate loyalty sometimes is going to have you go against the grain of your penultimate loyalty. Yeah.
Amen. All right. Well, for everyone who tuned in throughout September, everyone who commented and has listened to these conversations, I hope they have been fruitful. I hope something of what we have done here has helped you more faithfully follow Jesus, even if it's a waddle and not a sprint. Most of the time, we're just trying to waddle after the one who saves us. So, thank you, everyone. Stuart, any final words before we end this broadcast in our 4-part series here?
Invitation. I'm doing lunchtime book studies on talking to strangers. So send me an email if you'd like to take part Wednesdays or Fridays at noon. Yeah.
And of course, contact Stuart. If there's another book or something else that people say this could be another good one, I think Stuart and I are very up for doing this again with other content. So thank you all. God bless. And I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you, Josh. You're the man.
Oh, Stuart, I couldn't have done it without you, literally.